Okay, so here's a scene for you. There's a 110-pound Doberman with his head on the lap of a 10-year-old girl sitting in the middle of an airport terminal. So that 10-year-old girl was me, and the dog was named Maestro. Maestro and I were almost the same age. He was a little older than me. And when I was a baby, Maestro accidentally knocked me over, which caused my parents to understandably panic a little bit. Even though Maestro was a very scary-looking dog, he was, on the inside, basically Mother Teresa. He was a gentle giant. As, you know, if there ever was a cliched gentle giant, it was Maestro. But Maestro went to go live with my grandparents because he was just too big and clumsy for a little baby. So eventually, when my grandfather passed away, it was just Maestro and my grandmother living in a huge house in the Hollywood Hills. And even though my dad and I didn't live with them, we were all one big family, and Maestro was still my dog. And my grandma was a typical Jewish mother and hand-fed him gourmet filet mignon and cheeseburgers, and she got a new Cadillac with interior seats to match the dog. So if that's not dog heaven, I don't know what is. So he had a great life. So when he got cancer of the wrist when he was probably 11 and I was 10, there was no question that we had to do everything we could to save him. So we found out through the vet that there was an experimental cutting-edge procedure that we could have Maestro get, which was a wrist transplant. The only catch was that we had to go to Colorado in order to have it done. So we all lived in Los Angeles, and the furthest we'd ever felt comfortable traveling was to Disneyland 50 miles away. We didn't even like, going across town to go out to dinner with somebody because it was rush hour. We didn't even like going to the park to play because it was too hot. So going to Colorado was literally going to the ends of the earth. But there was no question we had to do it for Maestro. So that's where you find me and Maestro on the floor of the airport terminal. Maestro was freaking out because he'd just flown for the first time in his life. And so then we put him in his giant kennel and got all three of us into this little tiny rental car, and we drove through the Rocky Mountains to CSU, which was in Fort Collins, Colorado. And as we were driving there was a giant crack in the back window that started really small and then got much bigger. And we just barely got there before the window shattered. And we got Maestro into the vet hospital. We met with the doctors. We left him there for the procedure. And my dad and I went back to the airport. But because of the state of the window, we ended up missing our flight. And it was just a logistical nightmare. But long story short, we made it back to Los Angeles, and a week later, we went to go pick up Maestro at LAX. Once we arrived at LAX where they told us to get Maestro, he wasn't there. And so we basically wandered around the airport for 2 hours looking for this giant Doberman who was nowhere to be found. And we were supposed to call my grandma once we got him, and we were on our way home. But since we didn't have him, we didn't call Grandma. But finally, we found him in the wrong area with all of the extra, like giant crates and, big shipments and boxes where you wouldn't really necessarily find a dog. And Maestro was so excited to see us, and he had a giant bandage around his arm. And we got him home to Grandma, who was just beside herself because she was convinced that he'd gotten shipped to Guatemala and that she'd never see him again. And she had a huge plate of scrambled eggs ready for him, and we all fed it to him by hand, and it was a great reunion. And basically, Maestro lived another year after that. He had a bandage on his arm the whole time, and there were a lot of complications, but he was never in pain, and we always made sure that he was always comfortable. And he and my grandma continued to be two peas in the pod, and my grandma lived another year after Maestro died. And when we look back on all of these events that occurred, starting with, taking the dog to Colorado, we always questioned, my dad and I, what made it worth it and why we would not necessarily travel far for people, but we would do it for our pets. What is it about our pets that make it so much more worth it? And we asked ourselves then, the answer to that question was another question, which is, how precious is life? And we all love our pets, and for the reason, I think, that they show how precious life is in a way that people don't all the time necessarily. So that's the story of Maestro. And to make a full circle out of it, my cousin is now studying veterinary medicine at CSU in Fort Collins, Colorado. And Maestro's procedure helped a bunch of other animals who had the same thing done after him, because he was one of the first. And to wrap it up with one more full circle, I ended up getting married to a musical conductor. So the name Maestro really had a lot of meaning there. Thank you.